I'm going to talk about the first ladies, and in my abstract, I only mentioned three, as Ajahn mentioned already. So, Sung Ching-ling, who was Madame Sun Yat-sen, Song Mei-ling, who was Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and Jing Qing, who was Mao's last wife. But in fact, I've added a fourth person who happens to be my favorite, and this is a woman by the Chinese name of Jiang Fanling, who is President Jiang Jingguo's spouse. And you would see why I like her the best. So yes, first ladies, the feminine ideal, image, and influence in 20th century China. So in the first half of the 20th century, there was quite a bit of anxiety concerning what the Chinese woman of the modern era should be like. There was this change because for the first time, there was a creation. People needed to create and at the same time cope with new spaces and roles for women in the public sphere. What do I mean by this? I mean that before the modern era, Chinese women traditionally did not have a place in the public sphere. This meant that they did not have a place outside of the family system. So even the word to call them is a word within the family structure. So you would call someone, daughter or wife or mother or auntie or something. You don't even have a term that is used to call women. You don't have the term women. So you start to have these terms to call women as female human beings outside of the family in the early 20th century actually. And this is the first time where you have spaces in which women can become professionals. So women can go and work outside the house. Women can start to get educated outside the house, and it's only started to be possible for women to survive and become financially independent outside of the house as well. So in the pre-modern era, you have the only place that you would find women would be within the family, or if a woman were to have interactions with people outside the house, it would be, in very traditional settings, right? Like you would go and buy things at the market, but even that, it would be within a very controlled setting. So in the early 20th century, when you start to have this public sphere where women can interact with society as female human beings and not just as annexes or additions of men, right? Not just as someone's wife or someone's daughter or someone's sister. It was, I guess you could say it was a time of liberation, but at the same time it was also a time of great anxiety. And so in the first half of the 20th century, you have all these major pieces of social critique coming out in various forms. In 1923, I guess the most prominent author of modern Chinese literature, Lu Xun, gave a talk titled "What Happens After Nora Leaves Home." And this is, if you're familiar, there's a play by Ibsen, which is very influential in China in the early 20th century, The Dollhouse. And it's about women from the 19th century and their sort of this genteel household, upper class household, and women just stay in there. And at the end of the story, the heroine, his name Nora, decides to leave the house, right? Ibsen compares the house to a dollhouse, right? Because it's basically just where all these women dress up nicely and walk around. They don't really do anything meaningful. So at the end of the story, Nora, who's a heroine, decided to leave the house and go and find her own life, right? And this is very influential in Chinese society at the time, because Chinese women felt like, they want to be, the modern Chinese woman wanted to be like Nora. They wanted to leave the stifling environment of the family and go out and make a life for themselves. So Lu Xun was actually he's very progressive. If you're familiar with his works, you know that he's Mao Zedong really champions his work, and he was very popular among the radicals and the revolutionaries. But he sort of gave this talk to caution the young women of China in the early 20th century that, what happens, do you ever think what happens after Nora leaves the dollhouse? I mean, the story ends there, right, when Nora leaves, but when she goes out, she would have to earn a living. She would not be supported by the family. She would have to find a place to live. She would have to make money. And has she been educated in a way that would allow her to make money in such a way and support herself? And within the current social structure, would she be able to actually make a living in such a way? So it's sort of a caution that, the new idea of the liberation of women is kind of in trend already in the 1920s, but think carefully before you decide to ditch the old family structure that you're so sick of, right? And then around the same time, like just 4 years later, the very famous piece by probably one of the most famous modern female authors of modern Chinese literature, Ding Ling, was published, Miss Sophia's Diary. And this is once again this sort of expresses the difficulties of women in this new woman in modern Chinese society. And it's basically about thinking. It's very interesting. She writes a lot of short stories and novels, and all the characters are Chinese, but the only character with non-Chinese name is the heroine, and the heroine sort of, especially in this story, Miss Sophia's Diary, is kind of struggling with the new identity of being a modern woman and being outside the structure of the family. You see, when you don't have a Chinese name, you get to be an individual. You don't have to be part of the family, right? So her name is Sophia. No one knows what her clan name is, and and the rest of them are part of the family, but Sophia is not. And Sophia wants to follow all the trends of the day. She wants to have free love. She wants to be independent. She doesn't want to be controlled by the family structure. She doesn't want to be controlled by a husband according to the old norms. But then at the same time, Sophia finds it very difficult. Actually, the Miss Sophia's Diary deals specifically with the concept of free love and picking your own spouses. So if you don't want to be in an arranged marriage, if you don't want to be forced by your parents to marry someone, then you have to pick someone for yourself, right? And that's actually not a very simple thing for many people. And so Sophia struggles a lot with this as well. And later on in 1935, I find this very interesting because Dr. Dan just mentioned the new woman in the Vietnamese case, and in China there's also this film, this very influential film that came out in 1935, and it's actually I think it's like 新女士 or something. So it's sometimes translated as new woman in singular, but sometimes it's also translated as new women. And so it's almost the same word, and I find it very interesting. And the film is about the Chinese woman of the modern era. So this is a woman who divorced her husband because she was mistreated, and the idea that a woman would divorce her husband is very modern in early 20th century China, right? And then she wants to be able to support herself and be financially secure. But then what happens is that one of her bosses, or a high-ranking person in the company that she works for, kind of makes advances and wants to have her as his mistress. But then he's already married to her best friend, so she doesn't want to give in. And so after several advances, he decides to go and tell the CEO of the company to fire her because she's not a good secretary or whatever. But it's actually just because she rejected his advances so many times. So she's fired for not being willing to be a mistress of this boss, and so then she couldn't support herself and her child, and her child had, I think, tuberculosis or something, and then she didn't have the money to pay for medication or whatever, and in the end, so finally she was forced into prostitution. And then, of course, who should be her first client is the nasty boss one who tried to come on to her. And so life got really bad, and then the child died from TB, and then in the end she committed suicide and then died shortly after that, right? So it's a very tragic story of what happens to this new woman, right? That you're liberated from the family, but you can't really support yourself, right? And so, but of course, and this is not to say that, the trend in Chinese society in the early 20th century was against the idea of the modern woman or liberating women from the old, family structure. It was still a very popular trend, and of course, with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, also one of the major agendas of the Chinese Communist Party was to support women's rights. And in fact, later on, Ding Ling, the author that I was talking about, she later joined the Chinese Communist Party. And then interestingly, in 1942, right, during the Second World War, actually, the Chinese Communist Party had fled the persecution of the nationalist government in the Long March, and they had settled in the northeastern wilderness of China. It's centered in Yan'an, and Ding Ling had followed the Long March and arrived in Yan'an as well. And in 1942, she wrote a piece called Thoughts on March 8th, and March 8th is, of course, the International Women's Day. And this is quite interesting because in Thoughts on March 8th, right? So this is 1942. This is more than a decade after the first publication of Miss Sophia's diary. And Ding Ling says that the situation for women in the liberated areas in the communist area is actually much better than women elsewhere, right? They have more. They can get education more freely. They don't have to be forced into arranged marriage. There are no prostitutions, this, that, the other thing. The status of women in the liberated areas is much better than in other areas, but there's still problems. And what she complained about is that even in the Communist Party, even within the liberated area, women have to get married. Women have to have husbands. Because otherwise there's like gossips and people talk about them, trying to steal other people's husbands, and they're hounded by these problems. And then of course she's talking about this as one of the few women who refuse to get married in Yan'an. And actually later on, in my talk, you would see that that's exactly the first thing that Jiang Qing decided when she arrived in Yan'an, was like, I have to hook up with someone. So it's true that in the Chinese Communist area, even in 1942, it's even though there's this conscious policy to try and support women's liberation, this is still very difficult for them to allow women to be their own people outside of the family structure. So with these anxieties, I thought it would be interesting to look at 4 examples of what we might see as the ideal woman, or as the role model that women during this time would have, right? Actually, in the 20th century. So I came up with my 4 favorite women. Well, not really. Actually, my favorite woman is just this woman, Jing Fangliang. I'll tell you why. So Song Qingling and Song Meiling are sisters, as Santira mentioned. I'll give a brief introduction about them, and I'll talk about how they figure into this feminine ideal image and influence. So Song Qingling and Song Mei-ling, both of them are daughters of this very rich businessman and missionary named Charlie Soong, and he was very influential in Republican China. He has 6 children, and Song Qingling was number 2, and Song Mei-ling was number 4. And Song Qingling and all the Song sisters, and actually all the Song children were educated in the US. Song Qingling graduated from Wesleyan College, and Song Mei-ling graduated from Wellesley College, and so they spoke English very fluently, and they were very cosmopolitan. And Song Qingling, when she returned, she started working for Sun Yat-sen, and then later they got married in 1915. And Song Mei-ling got married to Chiang Kai-shek in 1927. So by the time that Song Mei-ling married Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen was already dead. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. And so Song Qingling, this woman here, was perhaps the first lady of the Republic of China. So she was the wife of Sun Yat-sen. And Song Qingling was perhaps you can say the first lady of the Republic of China on Taiwan during the war and in Taiwan. And later on, when the communists came to power, actually around the period that Ding Ling was writing about thoughts on March 8th, was just right after Jiang Qing got married to Mao Zedong in Yan'an. They got married in 1938, and she was wife number 4. And this is because I think his first 2 wives died, and then wife number 3 was He Sijun, who completed the long march with him and was a very able cadre in the Chinese Communist Party, and was still his wife in Yan'an. But Jiang Qing came over. Jiang Qing was an actress from Shanghai, and basically she decided that she would hook up with someone, and who better to hook up with in the liberated area than Mao Zedong. So they quietly divorced, and Mao Zedong quietly divorced He Sijun and married Jiang Qing in 1938. And Jiang Qing later on became the engineer, one of the leading figures in the great proletarian cultural revolution, and became an icon of the cultural revolution. The fourth person, my favorite person here, is actually Chiang Kai-shek's daughter-in-law, and you wonder why she looks foreign. She's in fact from Belarus. She's Belarusian, and her family migrated to Russia, and she was working there. And Chiang Kai-shek, who really hated communists, sent his only son, to study in Russia. And then, of course, he decided to purge the communists from the KMT, from the Chinese Nationalist Party, and so he was killing a lot of communists in 1927. So his son, Jiang Jingguo, was kept as a political prisoner for 12 years. So during that time, he fell in love and he married this woman, Jiang Fangliang, who actually has a Belarusian name, Faina Eptevina Vakreva. I'm probably like butchering her name, so I'm going to use her Chinese name instead. And then when he was finally allowed to return to China during the Second World War, she returned with him, and she remained his wife, his official wife, until the end of his life. And it was a very interesting figure. I'll talk about her later. So why do we have to look into these first ladies? First of all, I think they're a reflection of their era. So the ideal of what the modern woman should be, right? You see in the case of Song Qingling and Song Mei-ling, is they have modern education, and they speak English, they studied abroad, they're very cosmopolitan, and both of them were involved in a lot of diplomatic matters. They were kind of the international face of the regime, as I would tell you about later. Another value that you see in these women is free love. Interestingly, perhaps with the exception of Jiang Fangliang, the 3, none of them were the first wife at all. Song Qingling was wife number 2, because all these Chinese guys of the early 20th century, they're betrothed to some girl even before they go off to college, right? So at a very young age, they get married, and then they go on to college, or they go on to work in the military or whatever. So they all, Mao was like this, Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek all had this first wife that is selected for them by their mother. But then later on, because it was the era of free love, they would be modern and they would marry a second wife for love, and then of course the first wife gets to stay and take care of the mother-in-law for the rest of her life, and then these guys are all married for love, right? So Sun Yat-sen married Song Qingling, and Chiang Kai-shek married another woman, Mao Fu-mei, and had a son, Jing Jingguo, who was Mao Fu-mei's son. He's not Song Mei-ling's son, and so they don't get along. And then later on he divorced Mao Fu-mei and married Song Mei-ling because they got along better. But of course, many people said that it was for political reasons, because she was the sister of Sun Yat-sen's wife, so it was like being related to them. And Jiang Qing, of course, was wife number 4. So this idea of free love, of picking your own spouse, right, was very prominent. And also this idea of being revolutionary. So both Song Qingling and Song Mei-ling, their marriages at the beginning was not supported by the family. Song Qingling was her father was very much against that, because Sun Yat-sen was like almost twice her age and had already been married. But then she broke with her family to marry Sun Yat-sen. And Song Mei-ling also, because Chiang Kai-shek already had a wife and a son, and was not Christian, so he had to divorce his wife first, and then said that he was going to convert and then become her wife. Become her husband. And of course, Jiang Qing was a revolutionary student of Mao Zedong, and later became the leader of the Cultural Revolution, right? And the last one, this is very interesting, because this virtuous and dignified wife is a very traditional, non-modern Chinese value as a wife, right? As a wife and mother. And this is interesting because this is the quality that people describe Jing Fangliang the most. And I find it very interesting because I happened to be in Taiwan on the year that she passed away in 2004, and it turned out that they had a poll out, and Taiwanese people actually prefer her to Song Mei-ling, because they said that Jing Fangliang, this Belarusian woman, was actually more Chinese than Song Mei-ling, because she was quiet. She doesn't come out and join political rallies. She doesn't show herself in public too much, and she just stays home and take care of the family, and is a good mother and a good wife, and doesn't create a scene when her husband goes and has mistresses and has illegitimate children. So she's viewed as this like virtuous and dignified wife, right? And so this I think this also kind of reflects the return to conservatism of the Republic of China as a kind of counter cultural force against the People's Republic. And of course, these women are also the popular and international face of the regime. They perform many diplomatic functions. If you read, especially Song Mei-ling, Chiang Kai-shek's wife, she was very instrumental in negotiating support for the Republic of China. With you have writings by American politicians and also American generals about how everyone thinks that Song Mei-ling is the brains behind the government of the Republic of China, and they all like Song Mei-ling better than Chiang Kai-shek, right? And they put up with Chiang Kai-shek because Song Mei-ling is so intelligent and beautiful and everything. So she was a big PR figure. And Song Qingling as well will perform many diplomatic functions for the Chinese Communist government in the era after the passing of Sun Yat-sen. And Song Mei-ling in Taiwan, actually from the 1930s onwards, was one of the lead engineers of this movement called the New Life movement, which is a major cultural movement in the Republic of China. And the Cultural Revolution, of course, as I mentioned, Jiang Qing became this one of the leader of the Gang of Four and one of the engineers of the Cultural Revolution in China as well. So they're most of them are very active in this cultural sphere of the regime. Finally, this is also very interesting. Is that I think their first ladies are sort of bearers of their husband's legacy, especially in terms of political ideology. I think up till now, people are still debating whether Sun Yat-sen is a communist or not. And Sun Yat-sen is if you go to Taiwan, there's this monument for Sun Yat-sen, and it's called Guofu Jianian. It's like the monument, the memorial of the father of the nation. So of course, people in Taiwan suggest that Sun Yat-sen is the father of the republic, but people in mainland China suggest that he's a communist. But one decisive thing is that Song Qingling broke with her family and her sister completely in 1927 when Chiang Kai-shek purged the Communist Party from the Nationalist Party, and she joined the Communist forces later. So Song Qingling went completely to the side of the communists and said that Chiang Kai-shek did not represent the true intentions of her dead husband, and so she is sort of the Communist Party sort of chose Song Qingling as the kind of the survivor and the bearer of Sun Yat-sen's legacy. And in fact, they most of the time they really gave her great respect. And in fact, right before she died, she was made the honorary president of the People's Republic of China. So she's actually the only female president of the People's Republic of China. Of course, it's a honorary position, but that she would have that high regard in the party does say something about Sun Yat-sen's legacy in the Communist Party. And Song Mei-ling also, even though she was less involved in politics after her husband died, mainly because she didn't get along with her son, who became the next president, but she still sort of carried on the legacy of her husband as the kind of founding father of the Republic of China on Taiwan, and also of him being a war hero and him being a leading nationalist. And I think that the most well-known legacy of Mao Zedong is this like agrarian socialist ideals was carried out in a very big way by Jiang Qing through the Cultural Revolution, and of course they all support the One China policy, depending on which side they are on. So I guess the fact that if you look at the lives of these first ladies, you kind of see the trend of what the eras that they're in expect from women, and you see their roles as supporting their husbands, both as popular and international public relations person for their husbands' regimes, and also as I said, as the bearers of the husband's legacy. But in the end, especially having listened to the Dean's keynote address this morning, I sort of feel like even with this very strong movement to liberate women in modern China, I still feel that the position of the First Lady is still very much tied to the position of her husband, and it's kind of different from what Ajahn Raport was talking about the queen grandmother this morning, in which even after her husband passed away a long time, she continued to be active, and in cases in which I guess of the four women that I brought up today, only Song Qingling was probably, you could say, was really politically active afterwards. And aside from that, you also kind of see, if you look at these four women and you look at the popularity of the First Lady the first ladies. I find it very interesting that I would say the most popular of the four, from what I've read, is Song Qingling and Jing Fangling are the most popular. And I find this interesting. I think popularity of the first ladies have something to tie to how people feel sorry for them. People feel sorry for Song Qingling because she's a widow, right? And people feel sorry for Jing Fangling because she doesn't speak Mandarin, and she left home and followed her husband and came to stay in Taiwan, and very rarely goes out of the house and takes care of the kids, and then he goes out and has mistresses and has illegitimate children and everything, and she still remains this like faithful, virtuous, beautiful wife, right? Even though very secluded in Taiwan, and they feel sorry for her. At the same time, they kind of feel this Jing Qing is portrayed as this really evil, monstrous woman because of the Cultural Revolution, and Song Meiling is kind of portrayed as some, I don't know, power hungry or not Chinese enough, or not a good enough wife or something. So they're not popular. So I wonder if even with this whole trend of wanting to liberate women and wanting to support women's role in the public sphere, at the end of the day, when you look at how society perceives them, or their cultural, their social legacies, you still feel like the ideal of the feminine ideal remains this like beautiful wife and mother, right? And not really a female politician. So I guess there could be some debates, but I would be interested to hear what our colleagues from the Philippines and Vietnam think about this case. And thank you very much for your attention.